In 2020, Jimmie Johnson shocked the racing world with his announcement that he would race in the IndyCar Series following a 19-year NASCAR Cup Series career with 7 championships and 83 wins. While a switch from IndyCar to NASCAR has not been uncommon in the past 20 years, a driver going from NASCAR to IndyCar has been very rare in modern times. However, there was one driver who, like Jimmie Johnson, attempted an IndyCar career with absolutely no open-wheel experience after a long career in NASCAR. That driver was Stanton Barrett. Stanton Barrett is the son of Stan Barrett, a Hollywood stuntman, and Penny McCoy, an Alpine Skiing World Championships medalist. Reportedly, Stanton's godfather was actor and Champ Car team owner Paul Newman. His grandparents were Mammoth Mountain founders Dave and Roma McCoy. So it seems Stanton was a pretty well-connected kid in several different industries growing up. Stanton would follow his father into the Hollywood stunt business in his early 20s. At the same time, he would start to get involved in stock car racing, which his father also dabbled in the 80s. Stanton's first semi-professional experience would come in the Goody's Dash series in 1991. The series was basically a regional touring series for mini cup style cars you might see running at your local short track. Stanton finished 8th in the championship with 1 top 5 and 9 top 10s, but fields were pretty small in the series, and only 9 drivers started all 16 races that year. Stanton's first Busch Series start would come in 1992 at Oxford Plains, where he'd crash out after 39 laps. From that time until his attempt at IndyCar in 2009, he'd be a regular starter in trucks, Busch, and Cup, although never running a full season in any series. Although he sometimes showed promise, overperforming for small, underfunded teams, his results were overall mediocre. His best year in NASCAR was in 2003, where he would sign with Roush Racing to run full-time in the Busch Series. Stanton would post the best results of his career, with 2 poles, although one was due to owner points because qualifying was rained out, and 4 top 10s in his first 15 races. Unfortunately for Stanton, it wasn't enough to keep his sponsors interested, and the team shut down halfway through the season. In a surprising announcement, Stanton Barrett would join Team 3G and campaign the full 2009 IndyCar Series in addition to 19 to 20 NASCAR nationwide races. I can't explain how much this announcement shocked me. This was really out in left field. Let's take a look at the history of NASCAR drivers running an IndyCar to establish a background of just how unusual this was. In the 60s and 70s, there were a few big-name NASCAR drivers who attempted an Indy 500 one-off. The last of these making the race was Bobby Allison in 1975. In 1979, Neil Bonnet attempted to qualify for the Indy 500 but failed to make the race. Since then, several other NASCAR drivers have raced in the Indy 500, but with only one exception, these were all drivers with previous IndyCar experience, meaning they had in fact previously done the opposite, an IndyCar to NASCAR switch. Similar to these drivers, AJ Allmendinger would race part-time in IndyCar in 2013 after being suspended from NASCAR competition in 2012, but he had previously raced in Champ Car from 2004 to 2006. The one exception to this was Kurt Busch, who in 2014, 5 years after Stanton Barrett's foray in IndyCar, attempted and raced in the Indy 500 with no prior open-wheel experience. Another class of drivers previously raced in sports cars before dabbling in NASCAR and then landing a full-time IndyCar ride. These drivers include P.J. Jones and Willie T. Ribbs. Sports cars aren't that uncommon as a feeder to IndyCar, so despite the brief stop in NASCAR for these drivers, this doesn't seem that unusual. Finally, there's a class of drivers who came up racing midgets and sprints before looking for a career in either NASCAR or IndyCar. Prior to the 1980s, midgets and sprints were a common feeder to IndyCar, but by the 80s and 90s, this quickly switched to NASCAR. Most of these drivers, like Tony Stewart, looked to IndyCar first before a switch to NASCAR, but a few, like Brian Clausen, got their opportunity in NASCAR first before making an attempt at IndyCar. If you know of any other drivers who went from NASCAR to IndyCar that I missed, let me know in the comments. Stanton Barrett, similar to those NASCAR drivers attempting the Indy 500 in the 60s and 70s, had never started a professional open-wheel race at any level. So not only was he attempting something that no one had tried at Indy for 30 years, but further, he wasn't just attempting the Indy 500 one-off, but rather a full-season IndyCar effort, something truly unprecedented by a NASCAR driver. So Stanton Barrett was off to IndyCar in 2009 with 3G Racing. What the heck was 3G Racing? Well, apparently it stood for Three Guys Racing, but it actually involved a lot more than three guys. The first guy was Greg Beck of Beck Racing, a small-time IndyCar team owner since the 90s. The second guy was Curb Agajanian Racing. Mike Curb was a record producer with a history in racing dating back to the 80s, including his own NASCAR team. Kerry Agajanian had a partnership with Mike Curb back to the 80s as well, and Kerry's father, J.C. Agajanian, had owned IndyCars dating back to the 50s. The partnership between Curb, Agajanian, and Beck started in 2001. Now, the third guy to join the group of Curb, Agajanian, and Beck was Stanton Barrett himself and his marketing partner, Steve Sudler. Now, I guess 3G sounded better than Curb, Agajanian, Beck, Sudler, Barrett, Motorsports. So, how did Stanton Barrett do? Barrett's first time in an IndyCar was the February Open Test at Homestead. He was slowest of 21 cars testing on the 1.5-mile oval, although not way off the pace. The second preseason Open Test in March at the Barber Road Course surprisingly saw Barrett and 3G Racing sit out. That's right, a week before the start of the season on the St. Pete Street Course, Barrett and the team passed up on opportunity to turn laps on a road course. Stanton was present at Barber, but he only observed and got coaching from Roberto Moreno outside of the car. Now, IndyCar at the time allowed 6 test days per season for full-time teams, so it's possible that Barrett preferred private testing rather than risk getting run over by other guys in the open test. There were rumors he actually tested an Indy Lights car instead because it was cheaper. So Stanton Barrett was diving in head first, unlike Jimmie Johnson, who reportedly will get at least 7 tests in an IndyCar before his first race weekend in 2021. Regardless, it was off to St. Pete. In the first practice, Stanton was 6 seconds off the pace of Dario Franchitti, the fastest car, but only 2 seconds slower than Ed Carpenter, the only other driver in the field without a significant amount of road course experience. Second practice didn't see much gains, but by the third practice, he improved 3 seconds, only 5.5 seconds off the fastest car. In qualifying, he got down to 106.5, 4 seconds off the pole time. To me, not too bad, all things considering. In the race, Ed Carpenter would pass Stanton on the first few laps and pull away. Stanton would make it only 11 laps before getting lapped. To his credit, he reasonably got out of the way, not the easiest thing for rookies to do on a tight road course. Perhaps his years as a NASCAR backmarker helped him with that. He would manage to stay out of trouble and finish the race 4 laps down, and rather amazingly in 12th place. That's usually not an easy feat, but the race was a crash fest, and even though he was the last car running, 9 cars crashed out, and there was 1 mechanical retirement in the rather small 22-car field. This shows that the best result doesn't always tell the whole story. The next race at Long Beach would be another temporary street course where Barrett had never turned a lap, and in the first practice, he was rather surprisingly only 4 seconds off the pace. For some reason, though, he couldn't find more speed in the second or third practice or in qualifying. In the race, though, Stanton's pace would further improve. In the first stint, he'd run lap times just over a second off the pace of Ed Carpenter. The first full course caution would wave at lap 17, and Stanton was still on the lead lap. By lap 29, due to different pit strategies, Stanton would find himself taking the green in 11th place. Now, this was a guy who was only in his second career IndyCar start, And prior to that, from my research, he had only made one professional road racing start in IMSA all the way back in 1996. He was now in the pack at Long Beach among some of the best road racing drivers in the world. Wow. Now, a gap would open up in front of Stanton, and after a lap or so, he'd start to get eaten up by the field. After 2 laps, the whole field would be passed. But Stanton wasn't embarrassingly slow. He kept it off the walls on the narrow Long Beach street course, and he gave room to the faster drivers. However, on lap 37, he'd find himself in the runoff area. Presumably, he overshot a corner, but unfortunately, the Versus broadcast didn't show us what happened. This would put Stanton 1 lap down. He would run the rest of the race relatively competitively, enough to not lose another lap and finish the race only 1 lap down. The third race of the season would be Kansas, Stanton's first IndyCar oval. We might expect Stanton to feel more at home here, as he'd had hundreds of stock car oval starts in his career up to this point. However, he qualified second to last, ahead of only Ryan Hunter-Reay, who appeared to have some problem with his car that weekend. In the race, he'd run near the back, although not way off the pace, but getting lapped by lap 43. And then lapped again, and again, and again. By lap 188 of 200, Stanton, now 6 laps down, would make a long unscheduled pit stop. I'm not sure what went wrong, and I'm not even sure if Stanton returned to the track in the closing minutes of the race, but he was credited with a finish 19 laps down. Next was Indy. Stanton and the 3G team would have a big challenge considering the team, as Curb, Agajanian Beck Motorsports the previous year had failed to qualify with 5-time Indy 500 veteran Roger Yasukawa. Throughout rookie orientation and the first week of practice, Stanton was the slowest of all drivers. However, with the recession at the time, only 32 drivers were initially entered, so Stanton's best chance of qualifying appeared to be if only 33 or less attempted to qualify and there was no bumping. However, in the second week, Oriol Servia, Buddy Lazier, Thomas Scheckter, and Bruno Junqueira would all find rides and attempt to qualify, meaning 3 drivers would be left out of the field of 33 starters. In the end, Tagliani, Buddy Lazier, and Barrett would fail to qualify. The following week, the series would be off to Milwaukee, where Stanton would crash 19 laps into the first practice. The team would not fix the car, and Stanton wouldn't start the race. After Milwaukee, Barrett would find himself out of the driver's seat. Officially, the team reported some of Barrett's sponsors pulled out, and I'm sure the lack of performance didn't help. Barrett was replaced by Jacques Lazier on ovals and Richard Antonucci on road courses. I was a little surprised by this, as I don't expect Lazier or Antonucci were bringing significant money. I would have expected the team to just pack it up if they couldn't find a paid driver or sponsor. However, my guess is the reason is something to do with IndyCar's Leaders Circle program. The program pays about $1 million a season to full-time teams. While I can't find the exact number of teams the program covered in 2009, it's likely it was the top 20 teams, and 3G was the 20th full-time team. The team likely just needed to stay on track and not crash for the rest of the season to get their payouts from the program, and felt the combination of Lazier and Antonucci would be safer for this than Barrett. Barrett would finally return to the series for the penultimate round in Motegi, Japan, where the team reported he had sponsorship. He would start 20th, qualifying last of all drivers who posted times. By lap 30 in the race, he was the first car to get lapped. At some point in the middle of the race, Stanton would have some trouble, losing about 12 laps in the pits. He'd finish the race 18 laps down. That would be Barrett's last race in IndyCar. Team 3G would report that they were trying to put together deals for drivers in 2010, but nothing ever came about. Beck would exit IndyCar for good, as would Sutler. Curb and Agajanian would go on to partner with other teams, having a role in 2 Indy 500 wins, Dan Wheldon in 2011 and Alexander Rossi in 2016. Barrett would return to his part-time NASCAR efforts and would eventually return to IndyCar as a sponsor, being the CEO of Husky America, sponsoring the number 8 Chip Ganassi racing car driven by Marcus Ericsson in 2020. So how does Stanton Barrett stack up against the other worst drivers of the time? In terms of raw speed, even though Stanton only got 2 road course starts, he was already faster on the road course than Milka Duno. Stanton qualified just under 107% of the pole time at both St. Pete and Long Beach. Although Milka Duno's best qualifying effort was just under 106% pole time at Watkins Glen in 2009, her average qualifying effort at road and street courses was about 109%. Stanton also managed to finish all 4 races he started, something I don't believe any other backmarkers of the era accomplished. So I definitely don't think he was the worst IndyCar driver, but was he good? Definitely not. He had showed some potential. Had he been able to stay the whole season or maybe get a second season in the series, I could see him possibly being competitive in the pack, even with a small team. We should remember that Team 3G was the lowest budget team at the time, reportedly with only 3 full-time mechanics. Although Stanton had a lot of oval experience, the IRL 1.5 mile oval meta at the time was mostly about engineering the car to find slight advantages, and the driver's difference was mostly down to just racecraft and strategy. Also, consider Jacques Lazier and Richard Antonucci's results in the car. Lazier, a former race winner in the series, would have best finishes of 13th at Iowa, 13 laps down in the last car running, and 19th at Chicagoland, a mere 5 laps down. Antonucci, a rookie but 4-time winner in Indy Lights, was a much more experienced road course racer than Barrett and would post decently competitive lap times on road courses, but he could only manage a best finish of 15th at Sonoma. So Stanton Barrett went from being a backmarker in NASCAR to a backmarker in IndyCar. It would feel rather insignificant if he wasn't the first guy to try anything close to this in 30 years. 5 years later, Kurt Busch would run the Indy 500, and 7 years after that, Jimmie Johnson will attempt almost a full season in IndyCar. Will the trend continue? I'm not sure, but I think there's a chance. NASCAR is featuring more and more road racing, so NASCAR drivers switching in the future to a road and street course heavy IndyCar should be more prepared. Additionally, the Gen 7 Cup car is rumored to be a lot closer to an IMSA sports car rather than a traditional stock car with a carbon fiber tub, independent rear suspension, and a 6-speed sequential transmission. Also, with Roger Penske now owning IndyCar, we know that he's well connected in multiple disciplines of racing and would probably love the publicity of having other drivers attempt the switch. Finally, we have to consider the general economics. At the start of the trend of open-wheel drivers going to NASCAR 20 years ago, NASCAR was on the rise, IndyCar was getting battered by the split era between the IRL and Champ Car. The opportunities to make a living as a race car driver were in NASCAR. Now, 20 years later, I won't say the roles are reversed, but with NASCAR declining in the past decade and IndyCar picking up somewhat, it appears to be a lot more even. Some drivers may find opportunities in NASCAR, some in IndyCar, some may have a choice. Overall, the economics are there for more drivers to go from NASCAR to IndyCar. I don't know if any of this will happen, and I don't mean to overstate Stanton Barrett's role in all of this, but I think we should at least recognize him for being the first to attempt this and showing what's possible. So that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed and learned something. I've already got an idea for the next driver I'll want to profile as part of this series, so look out for that video coming up. And click on the playlist to check out my other videos that are part of this series on bad IndyCar drivers.